The restaurant was alive that evening, glowing under golden chandeliers that cast light across every polished table. The air carried the scent of expensive perfume mixed with roasted herbs and soft music from a live piano. Waiters glided between tables like dancers, their trays balanced with elegance, their smiles carefully rehearsed. Among them was Claire, the newest waitress, her uniform crisp, but her hands trembling slightly from nerves. She had only been working there for a few days, yet she already understood that this was no ordinary restaurant. It was where the wealthy came to show off their power, not just to eat. Claire moved quietly, adjusting her posture every few seconds, hoping she wouldn't make a mistake that would draw attention. She had spent weeks looking for a job after losing her last one, and this position, though demanding, felt like her second chance. Tonight, she was determined to prove herself worthy of it. At one corner table sat Eleanor Grayson, the wife of a powerful businessman whose name often appeared in the city's financial papers. Her reputation preceded her. She was elegant, perfectly dressed in a flowing silver gown, and known for her sharp tongue and colder heart. Even the restaurant staff whispered her name with caution before she arrived. She had the kind of beauty that demanded attention, but her presence brought tension more than admiration. Her words could lift a person or crush them entirely, and she seemed to take pleasure in choosing which it would be. When she laughed, it was graceful. When she spoke, it was final. No one dared to upset her. Claire had seen her picture in magazines before, but never expected to serve her in person. When the Matadi told her to take care of table 7, she didn't know she was walking straight toward the woman everyone feared. As Claire approached the table, she noticed the contrast between herself and the guests sitting there. The women sparkled in diamonds. The men wore tailored suits and gold watches that caught the light. They were laughing loudly, their voices filled with a careless joy that came from having more than enough of everything. Claire took a deep breath, balanced her tray of drinks, and greeted them softly. "Good evening. May I serve your wine now?" Her tone was polite, but quiet, her eyes avoiding direct contact, as she had been taught. Eleanor glanced at her without interest at first, then raised one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "You're new," she said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and challenge. Claire nodded quickly, offering a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am, just my first week." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, swirling her glass lazily. "Let's hope you last longer than the last one," she murmured, earning a light laugh from her friends. Claire pretended not to hear, focusing on her task. She carefully lifted the bottle of red wine, her hand steady now, and poured it into Eleanor's glass. The restaurant lights reflected off the liquid as it filled the crystal, a deep ruby glow dancing across the tablecloth. For a moment, the scene seemed perfect until a single drop escaped the edge of the glass and fell silently onto the white napkin near Eleanor's hand. It was almost nothing, a tiny mistake, but it was enough. Eleanor's laughter stopped abruptly. She looked down, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet Claire's. The air seemed to freeze. "Did you just spill wine on me?" she asked softly, her voice carrying more danger than volume. Claire's heart jumped. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said quickly, dabbing the napkin with another cloth. It was just one drop. But Eleanor wasn't listening. She smiled in a way that wasn't really a smile. "Just one drop," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Well, perhaps that's how it starts. One drop, one mistake, and then the whole place falls apart." Her friends chuckled, sensing her mood. Claire could feel her cheeks burning, her throat tightening. She wanted to disappear, but she held her posture. "I'll bring a fresh napkin right away," she said softly. The guests ignored her as she walked away, her steps careful, but her mind spinning. Inside, she felt the sting of humiliation, the kind that cut deeper because she couldn't defend herself. Yet beneath that pain was something else, a quiet resolve. She wouldn't let this woman's cruelty define her. Not tonight. The restaurant returned to its usual noise and laughter, but for Claire, The sound had changed. Each laugh, each clink of glass felt heavier now, echoing with something unseen. She didn't know it yet, but this small moment, this single drop of wine, was only the beginning of a lesson that would turn the evening upside down and show everyone what true grace looked like. Claire took a deep breath and straightened her apron before walking back toward the polished table where Eleanor Grayson sat, surrounded by her glittering circle of friends. The laughter from the table was loud enough to rise above the gentle piano playing in the corner, echoing through the restaurant like a reminder that people with money often carried their confidence like armor. Claire's fingers were trembling, but she forced her best smile as she approached with the bottle of red wine cradled carefully in her hand. This was not the first difficult customer she had served, but something about Eleanor made her chest tighten. The woman's presence was sharp, her words smooth but laced with arrogance, and her eyes cold and calculating seemed to search for flaws in anyone brave enough to stand near her. As Claire reached the table, she greeted softly, "Good evening, ma'am. Would you like me to top off your wine?" Eleanor gave a slow nod, her chin tilted high. "Yes, but please try not to spill this time. It's an expensive dress." Her tone was sweet, but everyone could feel the sting behind it. Claire nodded politely, though she felt the heat of humiliation already rising in her chest. Carefully, she began to pour. The rich red liquid glided smoothly into the crystal glass, catching the warm light from the chandeliers. Every heartbeat echoed in her ears, her hands trembling just slightly as she adjusted the angle of the bottle. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver for a second. She watched Claire the way a hawk watched its prey, ready to strike at the first mistake. And then, almost as if fate wanted to test her, a single drop slipped from the bottle's lip and landed silently on the edge of Eleanor's folded napkin. It was so small, it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by her. The millionaire's wife gasped dramatically and jerked back in her chair, as though something terrible had happened. "Can't you even do this right?" she snapped, her voice loud enough to silence the entire dining room. Conversation stopped, forks froze mid-air, and all eyes turned toward their table. Claire froze. Her heart seemed to stop for a second as her face flushed crimson. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she whispered, her voice trembling, but Eleanor wasn't listening. She dabbed at the barely visible stain as if it were an unforgivable offense. "You really should hire better staff here," she said, turning to the restaurant manager, who stood frozen a few feet away, unable to intervene. "People pay a fortune to dine here, and this is what we get." The people at her table laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was safer to laugh than to displease her. The sound sliced through Claire's composure. She lowered her eyes and murmured again, "I'm sorry," as she stepped back, gripping the bottle tightly to stop her hands from shaking. The manager made a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over, but Eleanor waved him off, her expression a mix of satisfaction and boredom. For her, it was entertainment, a reminder of her power in a room where everyone else bowed their heads. For Claire, it was a moment that burned into her memory like fire. As she turned away, she could feel the weight of 100 eyes following her. Her throat ached, her vision blurred slightly, but she refused to let the tears fall. She slipped quietly into the service hallway behind the bar, where the noise of laughter and clinking glasses dimmed into a low hum. Leaning against the wall, she took a shaky breath. The humiliation cut deep, but something inside her refused to crumble. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror beside the staff station, her cheeks flushed, her eyes wet, but her posture still straight. "It's okay," she whispered to herself, forcing a faint smile. "You're stronger than this." The words steadied her heart. She knew people like Eleanor would never see her as anything more than a servant, but she also knew that one mistake didn't define her worth. Wiping her eyes, she adjusted her uniform and returned to the dining room with the same quiet grace as before. A few guests offered her sympathetic looks, but she didn't meet their eyes. She went back to work, serving another table. smiling softly as if nothing had happened. Yet, something had changed in the air. The tension lingered like a shadow, and even Eleanor noticed that the room wasn't laughing quite as loudly anymore. There was an unspoken shift, small, but powerful. Claire's silence had said more than anger ever could. She had chosen composure over retaliation, and though she didn't know it yet, that quiet strength would soon turn the tables. Somewhere deep inside her, a spark had been lit, a promise that dignity would always speak louder than cruelty. And while Eleanor returned to her conversation as if nothing had happened, the rest of the restaurant couldn't forget the image of a young waitress standing tall, her spirit unbroken, even after being publicly humiliated. The restaurant had fallen into that uneasy quiet that follows public embarrassment. The soft piano tune continued in the background, but the air carried a tension everyone could feel. Claire kept her focus on her tasks, though her chest still ached from the humiliation she had just endured. She moved gracefully from table to table, her face calm, her eyes composed, as though nothing had happened, but deep inside, her thoughts raced. She replayed Eleanor's words in her mind, the cold tone, the laughter that followed, and reminded herself again not to let it break her. A few sympathetic customers had smiled gently at her since then, as if silently acknowledging her pain, and she returned each look with the same quiet grace that defined her. It was in that fragile silence that the next moment unfolded. Across the room, near the center aisle, the clink of glass suddenly broke the stillness. Then came a loud crash. Everyone turned as an elderly man at one of the larger tables stood frozen, staring down at a shattered wine glass near his feet. Red liquid spread like a dark flower across the pristine white tablecloth and dripped onto the floor. The man looked pale and embarrassed, murmuring apologies to his companions, who immediately tried to calm him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The other waiters hesitated, unsure if it was their table to handle or if they should wait for direction. But Claire didn't think twice. Without hesitation, she set down the tray in her hands and hurried over, her soft footsteps cutting through the murmuring voices. "It's okay, sir," she said gently as she knelt beside the table, her tone calm and reassuring. "It happens all the time." The man looked at her with a mixture of relief and guilt, his wrinkled hands trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice weak. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Claire smiled, that same small, genuine smile that had carried her through the night. "You haven't caused any trouble," she said softly, grabbing a cloth and beginning to wipe the wine from the floor. "It's just a spill, nothing more." Her movements were practiced, but full of care, not rushed or annoyed. When another waiter brought a mop, she waved him off politely. "I'll handle it," she said. "He doesn't need more attention than he already feels." The old man chuckled, his embarrassment fading as she made light conversation while cleaning. "You're very kind," he said. "Not everyone would bother." Claire glanced up at him with kind eyes. "Maybe not," she replied. "But kindness is free, isn't it?" Her simple words carried through the quiet room like a whisper of warmth. People who had been watching now exchanged glances, their curiosity turning into admiration. The same crowd that had laughed at her humiliation minutes ago now saw her differently. There was something about the way she moved, the way she smiled without pretense, that drew attention. Her grace wasn't forced, it came from the heart. When she helped the man back to his chair, the entire restaurant seemed to breathe again. Conversations resumed, but quieter this time, almost thoughtful. The tension that had filled the air after Eleanor's outburst was gone, replaced by a calm that Claire's gentle act had brought. Even the restaurant manager, who had been hovering nervously near the kitchen door, watched her in silence. He realized then that her strength wasn't in how quickly she served or how neatly she worked, it was in how she carried herself. There was a dignity in her kindness that couldn't be trained or faked. It was something rare. At Eleanor's table, however, the mood had shifted. She sat still, her hand resting on her untouched glass, eyes following Claire's every movement. Around her, the guests whispered quietly, some even smiling in Claire's direction. "She's the new girl," one woman murmured. "But look how gentle she is." Another nodded. "And brave too after what just happened." The words reached Eleanor's ears, and she felt something she hadn't in years: certainty. For the first time that night, her confidence wavered. She had humiliated the waitress, yes, but now the room's respect belonged not to her, but to the very woman she'd tried to belittle. As Claire returned to her station, wiping her hands and nodding to the old man with a final reassuring smile, a hush lingered in the air again. This time, it wasn't discomfort, it was awe. People could feel something different in the room, a quiet reminder of what grace truly looked like. Eleanor took a sip of her wine, her fingers trembling slightly. For a moment, she avoided her friend's eyes, pretending to focus on the music. But she knew everyone had seen what she saw: kindness, shining brighter than pride. And though no one spoke of it aloud, it was clear that the balance in that elegant restaurant had shifted. In one simple act, Claire had turned humiliation into humanity, and without saying a single word, she had changed the story of the night entirely. Claire carried herself with quiet grace as she made her way back toward Eleanor's table. The restaurant had settled into a calm hum once again, but something had changed in the Iran invisible shift that even the soft music couldn't cover. The guests still whispered quietly about the moment they had just witnessed, about the waitress who had handled an embarrassing situation with more dignity than most people could muster. Claire didn't seek attention. She didn't even look around to see the admiring glances. All she wanted was to finish her shift peacefully. But Eleanor Grayson, sitting tall in her designer dress, wasn't ready to let the evening move on. Her pride had been wounded, not by anything cruel Claire had done, but by the simple fact that the young waitress had managed to command the room's respect without saying a single word. For a woman used to controlling every conversation, that was unbearable. As Claire approached the table again to refill the glasses, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes cold and sharp like the edge of glass. "You're enjoying the attention, aren't you?" she said suddenly, her voice low but clear enough for the nearby tables to hear. The words cut through the soft music like a knife. Conversations around them faltered again, and a hush spread across the restaurant. Claire froze for a heartbeat, the wine bottle still in her hand, but she didn't flinch. The comment was meant to sting, to drag her down in front of the very people who had just admired her composure. But instead of reacting, she took a slow, steady breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the bottle before she set it gently on the table. When she finally spoke, her tone was calm, her voice soft, but firm enough to reach every ear in the room. "No, ma'am," she said, meeting Eleanor's gaze for the first time that night. "I'm not enjoying the attention. I just believe respect should go both ways, no matter who's holding the tray." Her words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. The pianist stopped playing, the waiters froze mid-step, and even the guests at the farthest tables turned their heads to look. There was no anger in Claire's tone, no defiance, only truth spoken with the kind of calm that comes from knowing one's own worth. Eleanor blinked, her mouth slightly open, but no words came. For a woman who had built her identity on control and dominance, silence was something she had never experienced before. The people sitting with her exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of whether to intervene or remain still. One of her friends tried to laugh softly to ease the tension, but it only made the quiet feel heavier. Claire stood there for a second longer, her face unreadable, but her eyes clear and steady. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't try to prove anything. She simply gave a polite nod, the same kind she would give any customer, and then turned to walk away. The sound of her shoes tapping lightly against the floor echoed through the stillness, filling the space that words could no longer reach. As she disappeared toward the service station, the restaurant seemed to exhale all at once, a collective breath no one realized they were holding. Eleanor remained frozen in her seat, staring down at the glass of wine in front of her. The liquid rippled slightly from where Claire had set the bottle down, the deep red reflecting her own face back at her. For a long time, she said nothing. Her hand hovered near the stem of the glass, but she didn't lift it. She could feel the stares of the room pressing in on her, the curiosity, the quiet judgment, but what burned most wasn't their eyes. It was her own reflection staring back from the wine's surface. A woman who had everything yet somehow felt smaller than the waitress she had tried to humiliate. Her husband shifted uncomfortably beside her, pretending to check his phone, and her friends avoided her gaze entirely. She wanted to say something, anything to reclaim control, to remind everyone who she was. But every possible word felt hollow now. The woman she had mocked had not fought back with insults or anger, and that made the defeat sting even more deeply. Slowly, Eleanor set down her napkin and took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but the weight of silence around her was suffocating. She glanced toward the counter, where Claire was quietly serving another table, her back straight, her smile gentle and genuine. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar, flicker of shame, but also respect. She realized that the strength she'd always associated with power and wealth looked entirely different when reflected in someone like Claire. It wasn't loud or commanding. It was steady, unbreakable, and kind. The room gradually came back to life again, the soft notes of the piano returning, conversations resuming, though quieter than before. Yet beneath the surface, everyone knew they had witnessed something rare, a simple moment where truth had humbled pride, and grace had spoken louder than arrogance. As Eleanor finally took a sip of her wine, her hands trembled slightly. The reflection in the glass no longer looked so certain, and she knew deep down that this night, and that single sentence, would stay with her far longer than she wanted to admit. The morning light poured through the tall glass windows of the restaurant, painting the empty tables in shades of gold and amber. It was peaceful, nothing like the tension and whispers that had filled the room the night before. The staff moved quietly, preparing for another long day, polishing cutlery, setting up tables, and straightening napkins with practiced care. Claire stood near the counter, polishing wine glasses, her movements steady and thoughtful. Though she hadn't spoken about what had happened, she could still feel the weight of last night lingering in her chest, the sting of humiliation, the shock of confrontation, and the strange calm that had followed. She didn't regret what she said. She only hoped she had spoken with enough grace that it hadn't sounded like defiance. To her, it wasn't about pride. It was about reminding herself and, perhaps others, that kindness should never depend on status. The soft ring of the entrance bell broke her thoughts. When she turned around, her heart skipped slightly. Standing there was Eleanor Grayson, but she didn't look like the woman from last night. Gone was the glittering jewelry, the heavy perfume, and the proud smile that demanded attention. She wore a simple beige coat and sunglasses, her posture less commanding, her expression unreadable. Claire hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. The restaurant wasn't even open yet, and the few staff members present exchanged quiet glances, wondering why one of their most difficult guests had returned so early. Eleanor took a few steps forward, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and stopped at the counter. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. The silence stretched between them like a fragile thread. Finally, Eleanor took a breath and said softly, "About last night." Her voice, usually sharp and confident, now carried a trace of hesitation. "You were right." Claire blinked, surprised. Those were words she had never imagined hearing from someone like Eleanor Grayson. Eleanor began again, but stopped herself, searching for the right words. "I behaved terribly. You didn't deserve that." She looked down, her polished exterior slipping, just enough to reveal something human beneath the surface regret. Claire placed the glass she was holding on the counter and gave a gentle smile, one that didn't judge or gloat. "Thank you, ma'am," she said softly, Everyone deserves respect. That's all. The simplicity of her words seemed to strike Eleanor more deeply than any lecture could. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing together as if to keep her emotions from showing. You know, she said after a moment, I've spent years being treated like I'm the one who should be respected, just because of my last name, my husband's money, the circles I move in. But last night, you reminded me what respect really looks like. Her eyes softened as she spoke. It's not demanded, it's earned. For the first time, she smiled genuinely, this time, and there was something in that smile that Claire had never seen before. Humility. They spoke for only a few minutes, but the conversation left an invisible mark on both of them. When Eleanor left, the restaurant felt lighter somehow. The other staff members who had overheard the exchange whispered quietly, their faces a mix of disbelief and admiration. By the time the doors opened for the lunch service, word had already spread among them. The once feared Eleanor Grayson had come back not to complain, but to apologize. Days turned into weeks, and when Eleanor returned again as a customer, everything about her had changed. She spoke kindly to the staff, thanked them for their service, and even left generous tips with small handwritten notes that said things like "Thank you for your hard work," or "You made this meal special." The transformation didn't stop there. Moved by the experience, Eleanor later began funding scholarships for hospitality students, saying that no one should ever be made to feel small for serving others. It became her quiet way of making amends for the person she once was. As for Claire, she never spoke of that night again, but its impact rippled far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Regular customers began treating the staff with more warmth, inspired by what they had witnessed. Her coworkers admired her, not just for her courage, but for the calm strength that had changed a person others thought unchangeable. She had stood tall not through anger or defiance, but through grace, a rare power that needed no raised voice to be heard. Sometimes, when the restaurant was quiet and she found herself polishing glasses again, Claire would think back to that moment and realize how much one act of kindness, one simple truth, spoken calmly, could shift the course of someone's life. And across town, in a lavish penthouse, Eleanor Grayson would occasionally pause during her morning coffee, remembering the young waitress who had taught her the most valuable lesson she'd ever learned, that true strength doesn't come from wealth or pride, it comes from humility, compassion, and the courage to be kind, even when the world forgets how.